So, we have a great panel here on shared services and organizational intervention. Carl Stenberg from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who's a distinguished professor in the School of Government, and David Kay, who's going to be talking about shared services and local government spending, who's from the Cornell Community and Regional Development Institute, and Catherine Lawrence, who's an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the Albany here. So I'll let you get started, Bob.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right, there's somebody still out there. All right, let me see if we need a little help from the PowerPoint.
Give me 1 second.
Okay. Okay. This one's forward. You got it here. There we go. Now we got it figured out. Okay. Now we'll get underway. Okay. Point, click. This research originated about 5 years ago in response to a request from the International City and County Management Association to take a look at how local governments were reinventing themselves as a result of the Great Recession. And at that time, scholars and practitioners were making a number of assumptions. Persisting hard economic times, which was called then the new normal, called for more than business as usual approaches to balancing the budget. The storyline here was the city manager who, after the budget was submitted, the librarian came into his office and said, now when are the cut positions in the closed libraries going to be restored? And her response was, they're not going to be restored. That's the new normal. Cities and counties are going to need to find new ways to reinvent themselves, in part because of projected decreases in federal and state aid, a forecast which continues to this day, resulting in something called fend for yourself localism. And thirdly, economic crisis is going to drive fundamental and permanent changes in local services and structures. There were several other assumptions. Those are just illustrative. And what did the research show? Not just in the ICMA project, but the research that was done during and since the recession. And these are generalizations. You can find exceptions to every one of them. But there are four I wanted just to share with you. Most of the budget balancing strategies involve cutting expenditures rather than raising revenue. Not surprising. Locally initiated approaches to economic crisis were conventional and incremental. They were not bold, they were not innovative. This is all consistent with the cutback management literature. Second finding, local officials were reluctant to enter into collaborative arrangements to share services. Despite economic pressures, they wanted to continue to go alone as far as possible. Thirdly, not surprising, restructuring remains an unpopular option, a third rail politics to some. The political risks outweigh the rewards for making more transformational change, such as eliminating core services, expanding service partnerships, and realigning jurisdictions through merger and consolidations. And finally, a good news, perhaps not so good news scenario, local government structure is resilient, and the status quo is very difficult to disrupt. To their credit, local managers and elected officials and other staff members found ways to keep the local government ship afloat during the economic turmoil. So that led to a second ICMA request for some research. Based on these findings, ICMA asked, well, what is it going to take to produce change? And specifically, do the states have a role in leveraging local change? And so we were tasked to try to answer those questions. We began with a review of the literature and websites. We surveyed all state municipal leagues and county association executive directors. We interviewed staff in key states that we found as engaging in some leveraging, and we began and are now doing follow-up analysis in 3 states. So while this is a story of kind of national findings, it does have a New York State application, clearly, because one of the follow-up states is New York, and I'll explain why. We looked at 2 types of strategies, okay? The bottom-up, or some would say the carrot versus the stick. What are the states doing to facilitate kind of cross-boundary approaches, whether it's jurisdictional or sectoral? To encourage the use of regional bodies, to provide financial incentives for collaboration, to liberalize procedures for changing local structure, to provide financial support for local planning and implementation studies for shared or consolidated services, and to furnish technical assistance to local reorganizers. Those are examples of carrot strategies that we looked at in our survey. We also looked at stick strategies, more top-down, to empower and shift services to counties through state legislative mandate, to also mandate regional cooperation and service consolidation in certain areas. State mandates to eliminate or reduce so-called non-viable local governments. Non-viable is kind of like beauty, something difficult to define, but some of the states were doing that in terms of the scope of services, for example, that were provided. Curtail state aid eligibility. Why should the state prop up non-viable, inefficient, or ineffective local governments? And mandate transfers of certain functions from the local level to the state level. These are examples of the stick strategies that we have looked at. What do we find? Well, some in this room know far more about what New York has been doing than yours truly, but I'm just going to give some highlights because we found actually 3 states where leveraging was part of a strategy embarked upon by the governor, sometimes aided and abetted by the legislature and local organizations, to achieve certain goals. In all 3 states, one of those goals was to lower property tax rates. While we, in an earlier panel, had some conversations around whether New York's association between the number of local governments or local government efficiency and high property taxes is correct, I should say in all 3 states the governor made that connection. It may not be the only connection, but it is a connection, at least in their view. Large numbers of local governments, especially smaller units that have duplicating services and are inefficient and wasteful, in some way contribute to higher property taxes. There's a connection in all 3. And it led to the strategy to intervene to either reduce the number of local governments or to promote, in the name of efficiency and effectiveness, the sharing of services. Okay? Governor Cuomo wasn't the first governor. He's the 5th governor by our count to embark upon this journey of lowering property taxes and looking at local governments as having some role in that. And the initiatives here these are just kind of illustrative. There are several more, but I just put these up there for those who haven't looked at them. Since 2008, the local government efficiency grants have been one of the cornerstones of the strategy, where funds are provided for studies, implementation projects, at one point transformative innovations with cost savings, or strategies to lower property tax. In 2012, the Local Government Performance and Efficiency Awards for innovations that produce cost savings, as well as the Financial Restructuring Board recommendations we've talked about. There were, by our count, some 52 dissolution studies and 92 consolidation studies have been funded, with 12 dissolution implementation projects at various stages and 27 consolidation projects. So there has been a fair amount of activity under these initiatives. And the Government Reorganization and Citizen Empowerment Act of 2010, which provided the uniform procedures for consolidation or dissolution and other aids to restructuring. Just last week, in terms of putting more money on the table, some of you know Governor Cuomo announced a $20 million municipal consolidation and efficiency competition program. So New York, again, has compared to nationally, done a fair amount here. By comparison, the top-down New Jersey approach. 4 governors in New Jersey have championed, again, some reorganization of local services and jurisdictions in order to lower property tax rates. Going back to 2007, the Uniform Shared Services and Consolidation Act, as you can see, provided technical assistance, financial support to interested localities. There's a Sharing Available Resources Efficiency Program, or SHARE, that now provides grants and loans for feasibility studies and to cover one-time startup costs from sharing of services or consolidations. In 2011, kind of interestingly, the local best practices checklist was imposed in order for local governments to get the final 5% of their local aid payment from the state in December. They have to respond to a survey. The first question is, have you actively embarked in negotiating shared services arrangements with neighboring localities? The real stick is S2, which has been around since 2012. It's passed the Senate and not through the Assembly, which recreates a New Jersey Local Unit Alignment, Reorganization, and Consolidation Commission. Studies are done to determine the efficiency and tax savings through consolidation. Interestingly enough, the Commission recommends proposals to the governor or the legislature, which are then put to the voters. If the voters don't pass those recommendations, state aid equal to the projected savings would be revoked. The act also superseded all civil service and collective bargaining tenure rights for employees. Not surprisingly, the League of Municipalities and the unions have opposed it, so far successfully in one house. Indiana is the 3rd of 11 states that we found, and this is just an example. Governor Daniels, in particular, put out a very bold proposal to eliminate all townships, which he viewed as non-viable local governments, and would have eliminated 5,000 elected officials. Also, not surprisingly, it didn't go anywhere in the legislature. What did go somewhere was a report that preceded Governor Daniels by the Indiana Commission on Local Government Reform. 1/3 of its recommendations have been approved so far, and as you can see, gradually they are transferring township responsibilities to county, as well as streamlined county government by replacing 3 person elected boards with a county executive who's elected. So, here we our findings to wrap up. Local managers tend to think their state as an adversary, not a partner. There is a paradox of local government home rule. Even in states where you have home rule, the state is intervening, not across the board to bring local change, but in very specific circumstances, such as ceilings on minimum wage establishment or gay rights, as in a number of states recently. We found only 11 states that had done something, at least as of 2013-14. And again, only 3, New Jersey, New York, and Indiana, that have made it part of a bolder, broader, statewide strategy. We found support for the bottom-up approaches, such as New York is taking, but not for the top-down approaches. Most of these are not part of a statewide agenda, as can be seen. We also found that it's helpful to have outside partners to help local governments think through, as we saw in our opening panel, the options that they have. So to wrap up, implications and questions. Economic crisis doesn't drive widespread change through local initiation or state intervention. If that doesn't drive it, what does? What will alter the local government status quo given its resiliency? Majority of states haven't taken significant efforts to push local service or structural change. Should states be more aggressive as catalysts for these changes? Or will the trend toward more restrictions on local authority, this home rule paradox, perhaps lead to more leveraging down the road? So Rick Morris and I, when we kind of reported to ICMA and continue to think this through, our recommendations are for states that are interested in leveraging change, take a bottom-up carrot approach, provide serious and sustained incentives, and link to broad strategic objectives. Identify functions ripe for collaboration, the low-hanging fruit, and develop realistic multi-year goals, objectives, and especially funding streams. Thanks.
Hi again, I'm David Kay from Cornell's Community and Regional Development Institute. The slogan of our institute at the moment and for a while has been something along the lines of let's help folks at the community level make informed decisions about the issues that they're dealing with. So this is one of many issues that we get involved in. And have been for many years. So let's see if I am as clever as everybody else. I will mention Bryce Corrigan, who's in the government department, is a statistician who's working with me on this project. Yes. This is the main question I'm going to ask. It's pretty simple. I think it's pretty foundational around service sharing. We're going to say more and think that a little bit, but you probably already heard it today. One thing is, I first moved to New York State and actually joined my category at Cornell's local government program in the early 80s. We've been talking about this issue ever since then. And it was being discussed before then. So here's from one of the earlier studies, a quote from one of the reports that was done when this was being looked at. This is a 1992 report from the Rockefeller Institute of Government. And, savings can be realized. I'm going to just skip over most of it, but the idea is there's economies of scale that can be had because we have so many local governments, and we can save money doing this by either merging units of local government, or what we're talking about here is more providing services on a joint or cooperative basis, and driven by the idea of savings. The comptroller put out similar kind of work, also not too long ago. What I'm putting up here is like there's been a lot of attention given to unit consolidation as kind of like the big, exciting thing to do. The history, however, of consolidation of local government units as a whole has been basically nothing has happened in that arena except for village dissolution, of which there's been a fair number, particularly more recently. However, if you look at the long term, there have been a lot more villages created than were dissolved. This is not totally up to date. This is this comptroller's report. So there's probably good, and the other big one which came up a little bit earlier was school district consolidation. Massive consolidation of school district in the 20th century. That's a little different kind of dynamic than general purpose local government. So again, this is just more about why, so if we're going down below the unit level to the services level, you would actually, at least I think from certain theoretical perspectives like economies of scale, you'd expect that to actually be more sensible. Why? Because not every service has the same optimal scale, right? So if you can actually optimize scale at, in fire services and police services and garbage collection services, you're probably actually going to do better than if you're trying to do it at the whole unit level. So these are just a bunch of, just kind of a reminder that there is a lot of attention from our governor, and you've talked about from a lot of other places about, this is a high-profile goal in a lot of ways. And there's money going into it in New York and lots of other places trying to support this. Mostly motivated by reducing costs of government. I'm just going to draw a little bit on some work that's just the next slide that's been done by some colleagues of mine in the past couple of years. including close colleague of Yunji, who made a presentation earlier, and she may have even been involved in this work. I would guess she probably was, but there is, I'm not going to show you this, I'm going to show you what's coming back. This is just, it's on the website, you can go to it. One of the things that they did, this is based on survey work, surveys of local governments. So, you know, this is just showing what are the motivations for intermunicipal shared services in the New York database, I think, right? It was New York, I think, because they do a lot of work also with ICMA. But this one was New York at, you know, cost savings, really important. Cost savings across service areas are also, these are outcomes. So these are not estimated outcomes, these are like reported outcomes by respondents to surveys. So they're reporting that there were significant cost savings. So that's kind of like a baseline thing to think about in these areas. And they vary a little by area. And just a reminder that, you know, not only have we been thinking about this, but we've been sharing services across municipal boundaries in New York State for a very long time. So it's not new. What excites me about that is that that means there's a pretty long historical record in the data of service sharing. Just a few words about literature on this topic, of which there's unfortunately not enough, particularly empirical literature. There's a split, like particularly recently more of this work has been done in Europe than has been done in the United States. And this is just a few of them. Mildred Warner, who's the professor, along with the Spanish guy, Germán Bell, who's done some of that other work, also did some, this is from a review paper looking at stuff. Almost all of the empirical statistical work is focused on solid waste collection as a service area. They're basically saying there's not too much done, there's not really a lot of really definitive results, but most work find cooperation is associated with lower costs. However, others find higher costs, and at least one found no statistical significance. So I take out of that, well, you know, it depends on the context. But more work is needed, which is good for academics. So here's another study, and published in Public Administration Quarterly, and this one was focused on government in Wisconsin, finding that overall expenditures increased in some circumstances and expenditure reductions were only associated with one service. So this is expenditure increases, not decreases. So anyway, again, for me, this is just background saying, hey, I'm not going to take anything for granted when I go into a New York-based statistical study about what the outcome is going to be. And here's yet another study. This is actually from Australia. And, you know, they take some of their empirical results and make a rather, I would say, conclusion, more conclusory kind of statement. Empirical evidence is suggestive rather than persuasive. Shared local service models by themselves will never represent a panacea for the financial problems we have. However, the judicious use of models can make a positive difference. So again, going into my study, I would say that's kind of like what I was sort of like positioned to have as my attitude about it. So what I did was, I've been looking at the comptroller's data for decades, and I discovered that there was a parameter, there was a variable in that data I'd never looked at very much before, which I'll talk about in a second. But the goal I had was to do a statistical analysis based on the empirical record, to try and explain costs. This is not a fancy cost curve model. It's kind of like a reduced form model. We're just trying to look at variables that affect costs. To look at multiple years of data and to do the entire analysis based on secondary data sources rather than on the survey, so that it can be repeated in future use and tested without having to do expensive survey work like Mildred and Germán and some others have done in the past, which it's also very interesting to be able to link to that data, but that's only a one point in time data source. My dependent variable is all of my work was using a deflator, inflation deflator, but trying to explain total expenditures by general purpose local governments in a county. So I was hung out for a really long time on all the degrees of freedom that I might have with 1,600 local governments over, we have data from the comptroller's office going back to 1975 in some ways. And I had to get over some various problems, which I want to talk about now, which basically were the idea that actually it made more sense instead of to look at individual government spending. I wanted to look at the aggregation of spending by all kinds of local government, general purpose local governments within a county as the unit I would look at. So it's really important to understand that. You can ask me questions about it if you want to later. Then I have a bunch of control variables that deal with the scale, the financial capacity, the types of indicators of need that would probably affect spending, and some dummy variables about year and county. And then the policy variable. So within the comptroller's data set is an indicator of intermunicipal service sharing. What is that? And I checked with Yvonne's staff to make sure that this is actually a reasonable indicator of this, because I didn't believe it at first. It's intergovernmental transfers. So it's not a perfect measure, if there is one, of service sharing, but it's a good indicator, according to them, of the extent. It's a continuous variable. How many dollars within the county move from one unit of government to another for services provided. So I'm interpreting that as a scalable measure of the extent of service sharing within the county. And here's I should also emphasize strongly, this is like, even though I've been working on this on the side for a really long time, this is very much preliminary work underway. So this is not like, take these to your reporter type numbers. The local press is like preliminary results, even though I've looked at a bunch of different versions of it. So we have 57 counties over 18 years of data. Interpretation of the sort of overall measure of fit for one of the regressions, which I'm choosing to show you now, is that the variance within each county over time explains about 70% of the variance in aggregate, and across municipalities, across counties, very high. So there's a lot, as you would expect, there's a lot of things that are explained by which county are you in. That's kind of what that's saying. So I'm showing you the result about, I'm not going to show you all the variable results and everything, just the one highlight thing, but basically the models I've done have pretty reasonable signs and sizes of most of the variables, and these are some of the highly significant variables, the things that show up in the models. Again, these are just controls for what I'm doing. I don't really spend a lot of time looking at those. And then the policy variables. So I have a coefficient that's minus 0.19, highly significant, and the results seem very stable. That parameter seems it varies a little bit from like 0.22 to 0.14, but it's right around there, and it stays highly significant in a lot of different formulations. So my interpretation, the literal one is up there. For each additional dollar transferred from one government to another within a county for services rendered, implicit, the total expenditure of local governments within the county are reduced by an amount of 19 cents. However, these are not statistically significant. That's what I meant to say. I was wrong earlier. So that amount cannot be statistically distinguished from zero, according to my test. So my other conclusion, and then I'll quit, is there's a hint here that there may be small reductions in government spending associated with intermunicipal sharing, but a statistically conservative interpretation is that there is no effect in aggregate. Now there's a lot of things that we can talk about how do you really interpret that, but I'm going to leave it there. This is what I'm going to do next, so I'll leave it up while our next presenter comes along. Oh, sorry.
Good afternoon. Catherine Lawrence, and I'm always happy to have the last word. I also, these are new, I don't really know how to use glasses yet, so I'm working on how I do that. Okay. Like, right, I can't see that now. See, I don't really know yet. Okay. What I do know is that I have amazing colleagues. So there are 3 of us at the University at Albany School of Social Welfare working on this project, one of whom is Mary McCarthy, who is here today, and our colleague Nancy Claiborne is doing other things today, so she couldn't join us. So I want to talk a little bit about our organizational intervention in 3 child welfare systems, but also this is a national study that we are involved in right now, but it's really built on 2 federally funded research projects based in New York State. One with child welfare agencies in local counties, and a second one with private contract agencies in child welfare. And I want to talk a little bit about NICWE, which is the National Child Welfare Workforce Institute, the current project we're funded through the Federal Children's Bureau. I'll tell you a little bit about the workforce development framework we're using, our assessment tool and process with 3 local child welfare jurisdictions, some initial results, and our implementation process in local sites. You also have some fun pictures that we handed out. The first one is this that I want to draw your attention to, which is basically, for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with child welfare, I'm sure there's only 1 or 2 who aren't in this room, just wanted to show you, this is really a way to this infographic really communicates why we exist, why the federal government has funded the Child Welfare Workforce Institute. It's that the workforce really matters. And for this audience, I just want to point out that turnover in child welfare is very costly. And there's an assessment for what that cost is of nearly $54,000 for when each worker leaves their public child welfare agency. It also has a significant impact for children, families, and workers. And there's research that has quantified what these impacts are. So addressing the child welfare workforce turnover crisis is an important way for local governments to also control some of their costs. Another picture I just wanted to share, I'm going to talk about the research part because that's what I love to do, but we're a much bigger effort. NICWE.org is a big information sharing tool as well, and so our research is only one small part of what the Institute does. Let's see. I said all I wanted to say. How about that? Okay, so so you guys have this picture as well. This is our workforce development framework, and it is deeply informed by several decades of research on the workforce and research on organizational change. So if you go to our website, each of the dark blue circles on the right wheel, and click on those, it will take you to all the research behind each of those circles. So there are 8 components that research says matters for workforce retention, and so there's supervision, there's There's a job analysis. Do workers have a job description? Do they even know what they're supposed to do? Are they prepared? Do they have an educational background that prepares them for the job? Or it's the training they get on the job, etc. So we've looked at and researched all of these areas, and we know that they all matter for workforce retention. And then each of those circles is surrounding the core of child welfare, which is its vision, its mission, and values. The other aspect of that is leadership, and we have an extensive leadership model. I don't think we brought that today, did we? And we have an extensive leadership model. Part of what we've done in NICWE is training around leadership at all levels of the organization. So we have a leadership academy for supervisors, we have a leadership academy for middle managers, and a leadership academy for child welfare agency directors. On the left-hand side, we have what is our change process, and we have a theory of organizational change that's based on implementation science and what we know about organizational psychology and what we know from our experience working with organizational change over time. So that's the foundation of the research that we're doing. So the research study itself, it's a mixed methods research design. And so here's where all the fun is. So we are working with 3 jurisdictions in New York State, 3 jurisdictions in the United States. They competed to be selected, and so we're working with the state of Indiana, the state of Missouri, and the city and county of San Francisco. We surveyed all the people who work in those agencies, all staff who are directly involved in delivering services or managing those who deliver services. So we have a sample of 2,910 workers. That was a 69% response rate. We also did group and individual interviews with staff. So we went to those locations and did focus groups and on-site interviews for a total of 508 participants in those interviews and focus groups. We also did an extensive environmental assessment. We looked at all the publicly available documents that for each of those jurisdictions. They provided us with internal data. We have data sharing agreements with them, so we looked extensively at existing documents. So then we also worked with each jurisdiction's HR division to look at their own supply and demand, their own turnover reports, their own assessment. And then we analyzed this data to identify what are the strengths and weaknesses of each child welfare agency. Then what we do is deliver all these results to the local agencies via a van-based roadshow. So in Missouri, for example, we had a bunch of 8 people in a big van driving through rural Missouri to all the local agency sites to actually give them a 2-hour presentation and question and answer period, so all the local staff could hear what they told us, so we could report our findings back to them. So that is the beginning of the intervention. Then each agency absorbs this information, and we work with them through the process of organizational change. But I just want to pause to say our real effort here is less on reducing fiscal impacts for jurisdictions and more on the outcome we're really looking at is how does this impact the well-being of families and children involved in child welfare. And so we know that worker turnover impacts child and family outcomes. We also know that there are many workforce variables that impact turnover, so we're really trying to impact those workforce variables. So the measures that we use across the jurisdictions are what's affectionately known as the COHA. It's a comprehensive organizational health assessment. And so we have a series of scales and measures that measure individual factors. We also measure unit level factors, like how do people feel about their supervisors, how do they feel about their peers, how do they feel about their team. And we also look at organizational factors. How do people feel about their physical environment? Do they feel like they work in an inclusive organization? How do they think the public perceives them? And what are the community-based resources that could have an impact on how child welfare workers can do their job? So it's an extensive tool. Did I go backwards? And then we take those findings and work with the agencies to unpack what one of the COHA findings would be on the left, and then what the agency response to address a deficit identified by the data might be. So this is one example from one of the jurisdictions we're working with. So then they themselves take and, we sit down with them and interpret the data, and then work with them to identify what their plan could be to address the issue. I mentioned earlier we have a theory of change. So then we put this theory of change into practice so that the directors and managers of the jurisdictions can try to identify, well, if this is an issue, and we want to get, here we are at point A and we want to get to point B, how will we get there? So they develop logic models and implementation plans to get there. And we make them do a logic model so they know we're serious about it. So this is the one for San Francisco state and county. So where we are now, is we've collected all the baseline data, and we're now in the middle of the intervention with 3 jurisdictions. And it's our expectation that through our intervention, local governments, the county child welfare agencies, can get rid of their ready, fire, aim approach and really take the combination of our data, training from the National Child Welfare Workforce Institute, and then in partnership with us, determine how they're going to implement organizational change. Do I have one more minute? So this is research in progress. We're still in the intervention phase, but we have been finding some interesting things based on the baseline data, which is that caseload levels. So in child welfare, you hear a lot about skyrocketing caseload, and caseload is overwhelming, but caseload levels do not fully explain workload overload. It's not the full picture, so that's one of the most compelling findings. We also found that so for local workers, the further away they get from the leaders, the less they trust them. So trustworthiness of leadership is not strong. And there's other really interesting findings too, I guess we could ask them about. But now I'm done.
So we have time for a few questions. Any questions for our panel?
Carl?
Wait,
Me too, then I forgot.
Patty?
I project well, no? Carl, I have a quick question for you. No, is it still? There we go. My name is Wade Beltrano. I'm General Counsel for the New York State Conference of Mayors. We represent cities and villages throughout the state. And my interest to you is, or my question to you is really along the lines of fairness. Was that ever looked at or discussed? Because it's a big issue with us. I will tell you that we're all about efficiency, but I advise my members to think very carefully when they provide services outside of their boundaries. And the reason is it's an issue that really has to go to their own sustainability long-term, and the fact that we have many cities and villages that are allowing parts of the areas outside of their boundaries to use their services a la carte. And they're doing that via intermunicipal agreement to their detriment, so they don't have to pay the full burden of the city or village's taxes. Has that ever been looked at or discussed?
It surfaced in some of our survey work, and thank you for the question. I mentioned that university consultants and others can really play helpful roles in efforts to consider service sharing, for example. And I think one of those roles is looking at the proposed sharing arrangements from a variety of different lenses, one of which would be equity or fairness from the standpoint of the cost sharing arrangements. But we've heard that as a concern from local officials who say we don't have that capacity. That's one of the roles municipal leagues can play in many states as well. But again, there's limited staff in the municipal league and lots of clients who could benefit from that type of assistance.
I'd be willing to make a totally non-research comment on that and right, we're going to relate it back a little to the kind of discussion we had earlier about the perspective, let's say, of the citizen property tax payer versus the perspective of the local official, and say what I'm trying to get at is, like, who are we trying to decide who we're serving and who's getting ahead versus not? So, like, there's certain kinds of arrangement. I mean, and I'll also say I've served as a local official, and what I noticed when I was serving as a local official, that because I felt I was representing a certain constituency as a local official, I felt a responsibility to represent those constituents in a way that, as a citizen, I was narrower than I would as a citizen, particularly around regional issues. So, like, I would represent the city of Ithaca, so I would fight for the city's interests, even though I might have felt some kinds of intermunicipal agreements might have actually been in the citizens of my county's interests differently. So I just want to kind of raise the perspective that we're taking as a question, not really, it is part of the question of equity, but it's sort of like equity for whom is what I would ask.
Well, this is, I guess, a follow-up to you, because the question is really difficult. Large system of financing local governments in the state of New York is very convoluted, partly because of the system that we've created. In your model, or your analysis, one of the issues that came to my mind was the fact that because village property owners pay town taxes for services they don't necessarily receive, when they enter into an intermunicipal agreement, teasing that out, is that subsidy of the town taken into consideration? How do you go about doing that as well? And the other challenge there then is, again, finding a system of equity, combining urban and rural areas that have different cost structures. So, for example, when the village of Seneca Falls dissolved, those residents were paying 0.59 per mil for their fire service, right? 0.59 per thousand, and the mill rate for their fire services. When that urban village joined a rural town, because the cost of providing fire service to a rural area is more expensive, their fire protection expenses doubled to 1.19 per thousand. And teasing those, there might have been efficiencies created, but it's a question of fairness, particularly when the cities then also have a predominant share of the real property tax exemption. So we're sitting here in the city of Albany that is really got a lot of tax exempt properties. I can go right outside of the city and pay a lot less taxes, and yet the city is providing services to institutions that benefit the region, right? So that's why I go back to, in my opinion, it is an issue that it goes to the heart of both efficiencies. I'm all for efficiencies, but we've created a system here in the state of New York which I think is unsustainable for our urban cores.
I would agree with just about everything you said and the perspective you said, and I would say that people like my colleague Mike Hattery, who spent a lot of time looking at like village dissolution issues and getting into the weeds and, you know, actually looking at who gains who benefits on a case study level, are doing the right thing in the LGET program, which exists in New York, which I'm very strongly in support of because I think it helps people think through these issues, just like the ones you're saying. They're very important, and I think some of the things you're raising up around equity are in fact the reasons that not many of these things actually, even after they're shown as possibly saving money, many of them still get rejected, right? What I would say in terms of my own work though, is I'm not trying to address so much the issue of, at that level. What I was trying to look for is at sort of this macro level in terms of the dialogue, if you will, the story that is being told in front of your work in many places, not just New York, and has been told in, you know, for many decades in New York, which is like, is sharing of services as an alternative to consolidation of municipal governments as a whole, is that really a route that is proven to save money? Which seems to be the reason people want to do it. And my answer to that is still very tentative, but a little bit maybe, but like it's certainly not going to be transformative. It's not going to like change the property tax burdens in a big way. You can put that together with what EJ was saying earlier, say maybe we're looking at the wrong issue at the center if we're trying to solve that problem.
Anybody else? I have a quick question for Catherine. Your model is developed specifically for the child welfare area, but it seems to me like a lot of this work would apply to at least other human service organizational settings. Is that something that you folks think about or expand to, or?
We do. I mean, the model so for example, we know that supervision really matters. They say that one of the sayings is that child welfare workers don't leave their job, they leave their supervisors. And I think that may be very relevant for other human service organizations, including mental health and other human services. But a lot of the measures that we use are not specific to child welfare, and in fact we've been testing them in the child welfare population. So organizational climate, the psychological climate of an organization is relevant across outside of child welfare as well.
Well, let's give the panel a hand. Thank you very much. Before we wrap up today, I wanted to remind everybody that presentations from this event are going to be online on our website, as well as audio and video. And I would like you to thank one other group before we leave, and that's 3 of them are still in the room. The staff here at the Institute really makes these events valuable, so if it's been enjoyable for you, it's because of them. Mike Cooper has been manning the camera in the back, and Joe Chamberlain, the sound system, and Patty's been helping out, and Heather was here earlier. Can we give them a hand? They really help. Thank you all for coming. We're adjourned.